don't know if we want to talk about this.
Okay, so it is
The charter requirement.
6:37 here, so we should probably get started. I have on our agenda for tonight, I have the FY21 budget timeline review, followed by review and discussion of FY21 superintendent's recommended budget. Is that still accurate? Okay.
Yep.
So we'll start then with the first item, which is just a review of the calendar. And I'll just turn it over to Miranda.
I was not prepared to do that.
I think we just wanted to make sure that everybody had the most up-to-date calendar so that we knew that what our upcoming meetings were with all the extra meetings around budget season. Sometimes it gets confusing, and we just wanted to make sure that everybody had that and is aware of what's coming up, so.
Yep, so I posted just before heading over here the latest version that we have with the latest location and time details that we have. Of course, this is likely to change with the city's announcement that they, won't be holding public meetings for the next month, most likely. And I asked the finance director, what that meant for our joint finance committee meetings, if he knew what that meant, and at this point, he really didn't. So I think we just have to connect with the city on, how that's going to play out.
Right, yes, I know that per charter, we're supposed to meet twice during the budget process, so that will probably affect in some. I know there are other charter issues that.
It's twice within 30 days after
Yeah,
the superintendent presents the budget.
okay, so somehow we'll just have to work that out. All right. Does anyone have any questions about the agenda? Everybody knows where it's located. Emily?
So I know things are changing fast, but given the latest with the coronavirus, are we're expecting at this point to stay with our schedule?
I think that's a discussion for us today. I do think that we need to, I don't have an answer to that. So I think that that's part of what we need to figure out. Today we needed to have this meeting because we have, it was scheduled and we obviously have to start our work. We made the changes that you see in terms of having the meeting closed to the public and so on. So if we're comfortable moving forward in that way for, subsequent meetings, I think that's fine. I think it gets more challenging when you're talking about a hearing where there's nobody there. So I do think that that's a discussion item. I don't know if you want to discuss that now and try to figure it out, or if you want to do that at the end of the meeting. But I don't have an answer.
We can discuss that now if you have thoughts about it. Emily?
Yeah, it seems like a very challenging situation if we hold a public hearing, and even if we figure out ways for the public to ask questions online via Facebook Live and other platforms, it's still only allowing certain people to participate. So I don't know what the answer. I don't know what the answer is. We have a budget timeline that we also have to stick to. So,
Are the public hearings required by charter, or?
Does it show? I have a little cheat sheet here of stuff in the charter for the budget process. I don't see it, but I'm not 100% confident that this is fully inclusive of everything, so I'm not comfortable saying it's not, but that we can follow up on that.
Maybe what we need. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Maybe what we need to do is move forward and figure out alternative ways for people to participate. But then when we get to the point where we're cleared to have public meetings, then we make new opportunities for the public to participate in person.
Tim, did you have something?
I just wanted to say, I don't think I would be comfortable with going forward with this process without allowing community input. I think whether it's in the charter or not, I think that's sort of what's the moral obligation term that we're using lately? Like, I think we need to provide ample opportunity for the community to give input into this process.
And I didn't mean for my question to suggest that we just get rid of public hearings altogether. I'm mainly, my thought was if it's in the charter, then there might be rules around what that hearing actually looks like. Whereas if it's not in the charter, maybe we have some leeway around how the format and, whether we can even do it in an online forum. I just don't know if there are laws around that, so.
And that's where my hedging was, not on whether it should actually be a hearing or not. I think that I suspect that somewhere in our own rules that there is, or in state statute around the budget decisions by a public body, that, a hearing is probably required.
Right.
So while it may not be stated in the charter, it may be somewhere else. So I don't see it here in the charter, but it does say things.
Something down here.
Mr. Rodriguez?
In school board policy,
I don't know.
in, I guess, policy DBC, it does say that we should have public hearings.
Okay.
And then it just becomes a question of whether a meeting where the public is not present is
Right.
actually a hearing. If you provide an opportunity for people to, to write in their input. A hearing is not normally a back and forth conversation, as you know, so it's less important that it be a question and answer, and more so that there is an opportunity for people to express their perspective and for the board to hear that. And you could do that in writing if that's legal, but I don't know if it is legal, and that's stuff that we need to
Right.
look into.
Yeah, so maybe it's something that we need to even engage counsel on. But I mean, my thought is, if it's something that we need to kind of think outside the box and create a different way for people to be able to have that public hearing in light of what's going on around the coronavirus, I would be okay with that. It may not be ideal, and I do share some of the concerns Ms. Figdor has around not everybody can participate that way. But, just given the circumstances, I guess, as long as it's fine legally, I would be okay with it. Mark?
Yeah, I share those sentiments. Going with what Member Atkinson said, I think we do, have a more obligation to include the public, especially a lot of people are concerned. And so, yeah, we do have at least that more obligation as reflected in the policy. And then, I think we should consult with our attorneys to see what the legal obligation is and what leeway exists, what a public hearing looks like. I'm sure that perhaps there may be some precedent out there. I'm sure this isn't the first time where we've had to deal with a situation like this. So maybe not this scale, but having a public meeting in a different way.
So does that give you some guidance on where to go with that?
Yeah, thanks.
Anything else on the agenda, on the schedule? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to discussion of the FY21 Superintendent's recommended budget, and I'll just go ahead and turn that over to Miranda and the Superintendent.
And so I would like to start with a statement about the elementary reconfiguration. In light of the uncertainty around COVID-19, given the questions that we've all heard about the elementary reconfiguration, and recognizing that it's unclear, as we just discussed, whether we'll be able to have the level of substantive community dialogue that we would need to have around the elementary reconfiguration proposal, I've decided to withdraw that recommendation from this year's budget. Let me explain this in more detail. Today, we were informed that large-scale meetings should be avoided. As a result, as you know, today's meeting was moved here so that it could be live-streamed, but it's closed to the public. The City Council, acting on the same advice, has suspended committee meetings for a month. It's unclear to us at this point what the implications are for our budget process, and it's unclear at this point whether we should continue to move on our same timeline or alter it to reflect this new information. Those conversations are ongoing, as you know, and we don't have the answers yet. Realistically, we don't know what the future holds in terms of school opening. While we're committed to keeping our schools operating, we will only be able to do that while we remain sure that they are safe. We're making preparations for an eventuality that would lead us to close schools, and I'll be discussing that in detail with the board next Tuesday. Given that, it's impossible to be assured that we would be able to take the necessary steps to make for an effective implementation of the reconfiguration proposal if it moves forward. As many members of the public noted, it was a lot of movement in a relatively short period of time. While I've always acknowledged that it would be challenging, until today, I felt that it was possible to do so, but I can no longer provide that assurance. So instead, I'm recommending that we move forward with the implementation of an elementary reconfiguration in the 2021-22 school year. Over the course of the next weeks and months, we can begin to put together the process for making that happen. I want to be unequivocal about the fact that I'm recommending that we still move forward with the reconfiguration. I'm committed to sharing my reasoning and the impact of the plan with you in the near future, as we were prepared to do tonight. I'm also cognizant that this will be a starting point, and I will remain open to making adjustments to the plans as we have further deliberations. I want to make sure that you understand that I believe that this plan is viable in the balance, and that in the balance, it promises a high-quality education with savings that can be used to further our commitments to removing barriers for students with disabilities and those for whom English is not their first language. Tonight, we will be outlining the implications of removing this proposal from my recommended budget, and we will have a revised budget proposal before our next meeting. I also want to be clear about some of the implications of this delay. Beyond the investments that we will not be able to implement this year, which we will discuss in detail shortly, I want to highlight two issues that will not be a part of the budget changes, but I want to make visible to you. First, we will now need to revisit our ability to scale up our pre-kindergarten programming in district schools. As you may recall, we've had a challenging time finding partnership sites that would agree to implement the program using our requirements. We will continue our efforts in that direction with those challenges in mind. I also want to underscore that we have a significant shortfall in our federal grants, partly as a result of less funding and partly a result of an increased cost of staff covered under those grants. Under reconfiguration, we still needed to make those reductions, but they were somewhat offset by reduced complexity in student population at some schools and by added resources in the way of English language and special education investments. That will no longer be the case. Our schools with the highest number of economically disadvantaged students will bear the full loss of that grant funding. Even if the committee, one more thing about reconfiguration. Even if the committee, the board, and eventually the council were to approve a higher budget number, I will continue to advocate for this change. Whether it's my reconfiguration or redistricting to have our schools be more closely representative of the city, a system where some schools have 70% free and reduced lunch students and others have a fraction of that, fails to leverage our value proposition as the most diverse school district in the state. I believe that Portlanders buy into that idea and that with time and energy, we will get there as a community. To not do so would be to abet a system that produces the results that we currently see and lament. While redistricting is not a panacea, coupled with investments in the right supports, it can be a game changer. I also want to be clear that I think it would be a mistake to ask for more than a 3% increase from the council. I am cognizant of the fact that we've received generous budget increases over the past 2 years. I've heard from my counterpart at the city, and I know that many of you have heard from council members, that the impending reevaluation of real estate will be a significant challenge for many homeowners in the city. And that was before the uncertainty of the COVID-19 pandemic inserted itself into our reality. Our school district will be facing a worse budget scenario as we look into next year and beyond. There may be a time when we need to go well beyond a 3% increase again, but for now, I think that we should be prepared to move forward with a budget that adheres to the council's guidance. That's it. So, any questions or, because if not, we're ready to move into talking about what the implications are of removing that from my budget proposal and walking through, lots of questions that that started at that were presented at last Tuesday's meeting.
Emily?
What do you foresee as the process to further consider reconfiguration outside of the budget process?
I don't have a specific answer. I mean, I do think that first and foremost would be to outline for you the details of what we are proposing to do. We were prepared to come to you today to talk about what that would look like in terms of how many positions would be saved, where they would be saved, what the demographic composition of the schools would be, what the actual class size would, the projected class size would be in every one of the schools. We were prepared to talk about the transportation impact. We're prepared to talk about the loss of CEP and what that would look like, and what the offset to the savings would be as a result. So we have done a lot of work truing up those numbers and putting ourselves in a position to be able to present those details to you. And so I still think that that's the first step. And then beyond that, I would like to get guidance from the school board around how to move forward with that. And so that's the process as far as I've thought of it.
Could we get a copy of that statement that you read?
Yes.
Just so we have it as a summary. Other no? Anyone from the board? No? Okay. Tim?
I'm sorry if I missed this, but are we going to get into the details tonight? Sorry, are we going to get into the details tonight at all about what is being offset from the current budget?
We're about to go into that.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Tee that up, I guess.
If there's nothing else, then we'll go ahead and do that.
Okay, so this is something that we're preparing to share with you prior to withdrawing the reconfiguration, because this was in response to Board President Rodriguez's question of what is Plan B. And so if you look over on the far left-hand side where you see the investment, we've laid out all of the different investments that we proposed in my budget on Tuesday. And then the cost associated with each of those investments. They obviously were all in my original recommended budget, so you see that those are all checked off. And then we have two different options that are laid side by side. One is what we would be able to do without the elementary reconfiguration, and then the other one without the elementary reconfiguration or the elimination of elementary Spanish, which was the other large programmatic reduction that was proposed in my budget and that is still is still a part of my recommended budget. So right now, without reconfiguration, you can see that we would be able to continue to have our pre-kindergarten expansion with the caveat that I outlined earlier about not being able to do that in our schools and needing to find partner sites for us to be able to do that. We would be able to partially scale up our curriculum, and again, we will look for ways to do more than what's envisioned there with grant funding, with moving other things around to allow us to be able to do that. But that is obviously our top priority, is to be able to carry that work forward. When we had our our prioritization activities with principals, this came back consistently as the top investment from a principal perspective. And then we have a legal requirement to be able to provide that continuum for students that are on the autism spectrum disorder. If we don't provide that in-house, we will have to have a number of those students be in outside placements, which will not be a financial savings. So we have to prioritize that above other things, because that's something that we, again, have a legal and moral obligation to be able to provide. We've been doing that through our Breathe program this past year, because we did not have any students that were that had emotional disabilities, and so we basically were using the Breathe program at the high school level for that. But as we have students coming up from the middle school with emotional disabilities, we need to be able to have a separate program for our ASD students, and so that's a major priority. So that's currently, without the reconfiguration, that's what we would be able to advance. I also provided for you what would be what we would be able to continue to do if we also did not do the elementary Spanish reduction. And again, this is in response to Board Chair Rodriguez's question about what was our Plan B, and you can see under that we would be able to continue the pre-K classroom expansion, and we would need to find other reductions elsewhere that we would have to bring back to be able to do ASD, because the amount of money that would be available to us is somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000, and so we would wind up, as you can see at the bottom of that column, short by about $200,000. So we'd have to find an additional roughly $200,000 in reductions to be able to move forward with ASD. So any questions?
Emily?
I'm wondering, in the column without the reconfiguration, if there were more resources. So there are several cuts that I'm interested in making elsewhere with additional resources from those cuts. For instance, what would be the next pieces of the investment and the next investments that you would want to bring back? How would you prioritize what is left out in that middle column?
I mean, we would start, we don't have a pat, answer. We don't have these scored as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have that somewhere, but not, there's lots of things that we would have to take into consideration, including how much money was actually available to do that. So I don't have an answer for you right now. Obviously, finishing the what is there as a partial scale up of our curriculum implementation would be one that we would prioritize, and then beyond that, I don't know. It would be in the LAU plan, and special ed caseloads would be the next top priorities. Adult ed is again a very significant move for our adult education department. They, they've got some additional money that they got from the state, and this is an important move for them, so I don't want to discount that as something that's important. And our website, for all the reasons that you're well aware of, also needs to be upgraded, but, that would probably fall off the, the priority list. Pre-K transportation, as I said to you on Tuesday, is something that we elevated in terms of priority because it was also necessary to be able to do elementary reconfiguration. It is, from my perspective, it's more of something that we would be able to sacrifice if we didn't have the full, the full 1.4 or the full additional $1 million.
Go ahead.
That just the transportation we know is a barrier, but we also know that before and after care, providing before and after care is a barrier as well. So if we're having to think of this time more as a transition time, I'm wondering if the pre-K transportation dollars could go into the LAU plans staff, for instance, and how you might weigh that.
I think that's what I just said, that I would probably, given where we are, reduce the prioritization of that to allow us to do some of the other things.
Anyone else at this point? Tim?
I'm curious about the partial curriculum scale-up, and I think it's phonics and illustrative math, right, that we're on there. Is it one or the other of those, or sort of partially doing both?
I'm going to let Malia.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you're correct that it's in reference to our phonics curriculum as well as our illustrative math K through 8 with starting to pilot Algebra 1 in 9th grade. So I think what we would we would get part of the funding to enable the plans we have in place to scale the curriculum. I think, like the superintendent mentioned, most likely what would happen is cutting the academic budget to the bone, so a loss of other things we typically invest in around a whole host of areas. Tell me if that's fair, but that's my current thinking, given the recent news and how we're looking at this. Obviously more planning and thinking to do, but that feels just really critical and several years of readiness work to kind of be at this point. And so I think it would be a loss of a lot of other things we usually are able to fund through the academic budget, is my current thinking of how I'd want to go about that.
So finding opportunities to save elsewhere in the academic budget and still moving forward with the phonics and illustrative math.
That's currently what I'm hoping to be able to do. So it'd be cutting other things that we have and offer and all of that, because this year the academic budget doesn't have anything that's not what we consider essential. But I would prefer to cut some of those other things in order to continue on the path that we're on.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep.
Adam?
Just as we're considering access for people, if we're going to be on digital platforms, we all need to really put our faces in these mics, because it doesn't go over online unless we do this. So even though it might feel awkward when it's just us in the room, let's bury our faces in the mics, please. Thanks.
Emily?
Be careful with how you share.
Yes.
I had a follow-up question for Malia. I was just wondering if you could provide some examples of what some of those cuts might be from the core academic budget.
Yeah, I think so. Curriculum materials, assessments would be a place we would go. Possibly cutting back professional development contracts. We have money set aside for new classrooms, and so potentially taking that out. And so we'd be scraping together curricular resources from other places around the district, things like that.
Okay.
Do you want me to start?
Anyone else? Okay. Seeing none, we can move on.
Moving on. So kind of shifting gears here, I just wanted to make a note so that this isn't a surprise to folks or misunderstood by people as we move forward in the budget process after withdrawing the elementary reconfiguration proposal. Because there was actually an offset to revenue, when we add back the costs of elementary reconfiguration to the budget, we're going to be adding back about 1.3 million in costs, as well as adding back 300,000 in revenue. So it's actually going to cause our bottom line budget figure to go up by $300,000. It has absolutely no effect on any tax rate gap in between. It's just really a mechanical move of reverting back to the kind of baseline state. So adding back 1.3 million in costs, offset by an increase in 300,000 in revenue. So I just didn't want people to be alarmed when they saw a different budget figure, which will be 122.6 the next time we come back to you with the bottom line figure. Is that clear? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep.
And like we saw in the other slide, there was a without reconfiguration, and then there was a separate without reconfiguration, and also without plus world languages. So this represents world
This
languages.
represents no reconfiguration, but still world language.
It wouldn't change with world language because there's no revenue offset for that. Yep. So we would be, swapping out reductions for investments on the cost side. So it wouldn't impact the bottom line. Okay. So next we were going to move on to looking at staffing in response to questions that a few board members asked at the board meeting. So just wanted to start off from our very baseline level, our FY20 budgeted FTE, which is in that top left-hand corner. And the list of staff that you see here are additions that we made over the course of the current year. So that is actually our current staffing picture. So over the course of the year, we added 17.1 positions. The first, 6 are classroom teacher positions, so 3 at Portland High School, an increase to a science teacher at Deering, and 2 elementary classrooms were added. And then the next several are special education additions. So we added a beach autism spectrum disorder classroom at Ocean, 1 teacher, 7 ed techs, and then a couple special ed adjustments for Cliff, some health assistants at the elementary level, a small FTE increase for 1 Breathe staff member, an adjustment at adult ed. I believe that was a swap out of somebody who was kind of already working temp salaries, and they just turned it into a formal FTE. The next one on the list, these are just next to a couple miscellaneous adjustments. We accidentally dropped a small FTE in the budget process last year in ELL, and that was just making that right, that 0.41. We had some swapping of FTEs from grant-funded sources to local fund and vice versa. And so we ended up moving some ed techs onto Title III, moving parent and community specialists who were previously budgeted on Title III onto the local fund. And there was no net dollar change for that. It was just a net FTE change because the different positions pay at different rates. And so it was just the net end result was a reduction of 0.75 ed techs overall. We added a 0.75 Make It Happen coordinator, a bus driver, a small increase to the FTE of a bus driver trainee, and a small increase to a custodian at adult ed. So those are all the changes that we made over the course of this year.
Can I just briefly mentioned the Make It Happen coordinator was something that, that is the Make It Happen coordinator here at Casco Bay. That position was accidentally left off of the budget last year. We intended to have that position to complete our Make It Happen staffing across the district, and so that was added in. And then the bus driver and the bus driver trainee were adjustments that we made over the course of the year to be able to have the staffing necessary and get out of the contractual sites. So those were additions for our McKinney-Vento transportation and some of the additional reconfiguration of our transportation department to allow us to, to be able to serve our needs.
Any questions about that? No? Okay.
All right, so now we'll move into the proposed adjustments, staffing adjustments for FY21. So these were the enrollment-based adjustments. All of these are outlined in the budget book as well. So the way we did this was we started off with sort of a baseline assumption from the beginning of our, starting out with our current configuration. So in our current configuration, we will need to add a net of 2 classroom teachers at the elementary level. From this point, which is how we budgeted all along, we would have seen a reduction of 20 classrooms if we did reconfigure. So now, backing out the reconfiguration, we're back to this point, and we need to retain all of these enrollment-based adjustments. So a teacher at Presumpscot, a teacher at Reiki, a reduction of a classroom at Riverton, and an increase at Rowe, for a net of 2. And then we have the 3 high school reductions that were pointed out on Tuesday. So that comes to a net decrease of 1 FTE. Did you have a question, Emily?
Sorry, I didn't realize these were just, I was looking, and I'm also looking on the next slide, so sorry if I got ahead of us, but I'm looking for the food service position as well. Is that?
That was not in my budget.
That was not in the budget in the end. Okay.
Okay, so this is basically the same list that you have in the budget book with strikeouts of the positions now that we are withdrawing the elementary reconfiguration proposal. So this is what we are left with. The 4 pre-K FTEs, 2 teachers, 2 ed techs, and then the staffing needed for the ASD classrooms, and that's a net increase of 10 FTEs.
The strikeout of the bus drivers and bus assistants, is that assuming that we don't do the pre-K transportation?
This is all assuming that we don't have the resources from the reconfiguration, and therefore all of these positions which would have been funded through the reconfiguration are eliminated.
Sorry, I'm looking at the chart, but I was not fully realizing that that pre-K transportation was not included, so my apologies.
Yeah, and I wasn't clear. These are all of the staffing that would have been added with our new investments, and the bus drivers and the bus assistants that are listed here specifically are the pre-K ones, and I should have labeled it that way. Any other questions on this?
I don't think so.
And so of the original list of reductions, we are now striking out all of the ones that were associated with elementary reconfiguration, and that leaves 3.95 net reduction in elementary Spanish and 1 reduction of a custodian for a reduction of about 5 FTEs.
And there were also reductions at like 3 at the high school level, and so are those still included, or?
Yep, those are in the first slide. I'm calling them enrollment-based decreases.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that?
I think we can.
Yeah, and so this is just a summary of what I just said. So from the original budgeted FTE for FY20, we add 17.1 to get to our adjusted levels. Then we subtract 1 for enrollment-based adjustments, we add 10 for investments, and subtract 5 for a net increase versus the original FY20 budget of 21.15 FTEs.
Any questions? Adam?
Going back a slide, I just need clarification on the Spanish teachers. Are those additions or those are reductions related to?
To the elimination of 4th and 5th grade Spanish.
Right, so yeah, to clarify this slide, in the same way we crossed out the investments, we're now crossing out the reductions that we are no longer making. And so the list of positions that are not crossed out are the ones that we do, at this point, still propose to reduce.
Understood, just one of those double negative.
Yep,
confusing
absolutely.
moments.
So this is the last slide on staffing before we move on to different topics. So is there any other questions on that? Okay. So just last on reductions, just the non-FTE reductions. Listing that out here, we were asked by a board member at the board meeting for more detail on some of the central office reductions. So those are delineated here. We have $70,000 in transportation contractual services, which I don't think we specifically called out in the presentation on Tuesday, and that is related to the new staffing strategy for transportation. I think we talked about it in a previous finance committee meeting. We have 2 contracts, one for $50,000 for special ed contractual routes and another for $50,000 for homeless contractual routes. Barely any spending on that at all this year because of the fact that we actually have bus drivers in place and are able to do these routes. So it's also related to the adjustment in the bus driver and the small FTE increase that we had in transportation on another position. That's all driving this. So that's why we're making that reduction. And I think we mentioned on Tuesday the reduction in superintendent's contractual services, board contingency. Do you want to talk about Long
Island tuition, one of the things that the work group came up with was looking at the possibility of moving our students who are on Diamond Island to Peaks, and that so we did our due diligence around that. It was difficult to execute on and problematic on a number of fronts. And so we engaged in a conversation with the superintendent of Long Island. They basically reduced their bill by $30,000. So it was scheduled to go up by how much? By that 30,000, and so they basically just, even though they have one more student, and even though their tuition costs went up, they allowed us to keep our, our payments to them at that same level.
So the non-rep COLAs, this is really, it's not a reduction per se, but it was a tightening of our assumption from the point at which we had a $450,000 budget gap. So it's an adjustment that we made since that time that saved us $57,000. And then we have the 3% supplies reduction across the board and the 2% reduction to high school athletics and co-curricular that we talked about at the board meeting on Tuesday as well. Any questions on these? No?
Let me just point out that we do know that there are a number of questions about athletics, and so at a subsequent finance committee meeting, we'll be prepared to talk about that. But we weren't ready for that today.
Okay. So at this point, we're going to move on to kind of a deep dive on what we do offer for elementary Spanish. We're going to move to Carlos Gomez for that.
Thank you. Buenas noches. I'm here to talk about the elementary Spanish program that you're considering, and just want to put it in context, as it is part of our overall district language program, which would continue at the middle school and the high school level. Oops. Yeah. Do you,
I'll move.
Sorry, girls. I forgot I had a slide inserted in here. So this is just restating the staffing reductions associated with this proposal. And I also just wanted to explain a little bit the estimated cost savings. So at a point in time in the fall when we were working with the cost savings committee, we came up with a figure of the cost of world language being closer to $350,000, I think is the figure. But that was the actual cost of the program with the actual teachers, right? So the reductions are not cutting out that actual cost. The reductions are eliminating 4 positions of low seniority. And so I had to go with the generic expectation or assumption of what we would save for each of those positions. So it's not, the cost of the program is not the same as the potential savings. So I just wanted to explain that difference. Also, we did not include in this proposed reduction the 0.8 teacher at Ocean Ave due to the requirement that it remain because of IB. And also just pointing out again that Spanish immersion is not included in this proposal.
thank you for that. So as you consider the Spanish program, this is who we serve. So approximately 1,000 students in the 4th and 5th grade. At our elementary schools, as well as 2nd and 3rd graders at Ocean Avenue in their International Baccalaureate program. Out of those total students, approximately 28% or so are English learners who, to varying degrees, also participate in the language program, some of them having great success, some of them having challenges, but they are part of this group as well. In terms of curriculum and programmatic goals, the main focus of the program is around communication, so reading, writing, listening, and speaking through 3 modes of communication. This is what is the staple of our language program across the district, middle school and high school, as well as immersion. There's also the cultural piece, so investigating products and practices to understand cultural perspectives, the ability and the propensity to interact with people from other cultures is a key piece. So communication and culture, as you would imagine, are centerpieces of this. Our goal in the elementary world language program is to have our students reach at least a novice low level of proficiency. The American Council for Teaching of Foreign Languages has a really nice description of what that looks like, all the way through advanced proficiency. So what we're asking our 5th graders to do by the end of their elementary program is to understand some simple, single memorized words or phrases to present information about themselves and familiar topics using some of those phrases, and asking and answering simple questions using that vocabulary. So that's in terms of the communication. Another way to look at this is around the 5 C's. So that includes communication and cultures, but looking at the green ring, for example, part of our work at the elementary level is to make connections to other subject areas and other aspects of languages, to compare languages and cultures, preferably in the target language when possible, and to make connections to communities that speak this language. So there is a lot of background knowledge building about who who speaks Spanish, the role of Spanish in the United States and in the world, the connection of Spanish to the home languages of many of our students. And really, this is, I think, what probably is most exciting for our teachers is making that cultural connection, some conversation about what culture is. You're probably familiar with the cultural iceberg. Some of the things that are more visible allow for those conversations about what's under those that cultural learning. As far as what are the results of our elementary Spanish program, unfortunately, we're data light on this. We do not have current, concrete, and objective data, for example, on the Apple and Avant test that we use for our seal of biliteracy, specifically for our students who speak, who take elementary language. We do have it for immersion programs. And it does indicate some good progress, I should say. I would venture to say that many of our students would do well on these after their elementary Spanish exposure, and many wouldn't do as well. The research around language learning at a young age indicates that there's a tremendous impact on brain development. Tough to quantify given our capacity right now. In terms of the seal of biliteracy, one of the goals is to have as many students graduate with the seal of biliteracy, and ultimately I'd love to see our school district be able to graduate every student bilingual in English and at least one other language. But currently our seniors who are eligible for the seal of biliteracy, about 30% of them took Spanish in third grade. Not to say that that is the reason why they're getting the seal of biliteracy, but there is perhaps some effect there. As you consider eliminating the elementary Spanish program, some things that you should know. Our elementary principals did identify this program as a priority for cost reduction. The fact that it's twice a week for 45 minutes would free up that time for alternative instruction. There are some very challenging logistics in terms of reaching full efficiency in scheduling 4.5 teaching positions at 9 schools, many of them with different start times, end times, lunch times, etc., as well as the other specials that they have. By eliminating or some reasons to keep the elementary Spanish program, that effect on brain development is something that we all value, and this is an area for that growth. In the future, starting younger will probably lead to deeper and more widespread language learning in the future, not just of the Spanish that's being studied, but languages in general. Introducing students to new languages and new cultures at an earlier age builds that community and that cultural literacy and global competence that is part of our Portland Promise. This would affirm the value of multilingualism as an asset, keeping elementary Spanish. But I know that these are some of the things that you might be considering as you deliberate this decision point. So just wanted you to have that information. I think that's it. Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah. Any questions?
Emily?
Carlos, I'm interested in if we need to cut this program, I'm interested in your thoughts on our Wabanaki curriculum filling some of the role that that elementary Spanish currently fills, in terms of learning about and appreciating and understanding other cultures and to some extent other languages?
I think anytime you're introducing language and culture into the curriculum, great opportunities to expand that conversation and to make connections to students' experiences, languages, cultures, and identities. So that I don't know if that would right.
I can, yeah. I mean, we haven't had conversations about how we would repurpose that instructional time. So I think there's a lot already that competes for the time that we have. But I think that would be a good example of how we would retain some of the values and components of this program that are really positive, of course. And it is true that right now one of the challenges to having a more robust social studies, Wabanaki studies, and frankly STEM experience across elementary is that teachers report there just doesn't seem to be enough time. Of course, we're working on integrated learning across content areas, but more instructional time, I'm sure there's a lot that could be used, and that's a perfect example of how that might get reallocated.
May I make a comment?
Yes, go ahead.
I look forward to hearing about how that time could be reallocated, and I'll just put in a plug in for student-directed outdoor time as a great use of such an opportunity, as well as additional social emotional time.
Emily?
I guess I have another question for Carlos. I am curious about our decision to, I realize it's a beloved program in the community, but our decision to keep the Spanish language immersion program, given all of these other cuts. And I'm wondering, in particular, given our equity lens, I'm not sure the immersion program kind of fits within that lens because there aren't native Spanish speakers, my understanding is, that who can participate in the program. So can you talk about your thinking of keep it. I fully understand how much people, appreciate that program, but it does seem like it's outside the model that we're working under and striving towards, and so be interested in your feedback on that.
You want to take us?
Yeah, let me start because I made the decision to not cut that from the budget. And I do want to be clear that all of those issues that you raised are issues that are on my mind as well. I do believe that that is a substantive conversation for the board to have. The board that moved that program forward at one point has changed substantially. Our focus as a district has changed substantially. Our recognition of some of the foundational dynamics of our district have changed substantially. From my perspective, the families that made a commitment to that program, we owe them to be able to bring their children through the program. So if in the future the board decided, at our recommendation or on its own to end that program, the appropriate way to do that would be to no longer enroll a kindergarten class and then be able to continue to move the classes through until they move on to the high school and then not be able to, not have that commitment at perpetuity, but also not leave somebody who's been through to third grade learning only Spanish, now having to switch over to learning all in English. So I do think that that's the thinking that went into that. So I do look forward to having that conversation. I know that we, as a staff, have talked about some of the some of the disconnect between that, the way that that program was structured, and our reality as a community. I think that, if we were doing it today, for us to think about having it be a dual immersion experience with students who are French speakers or, Portuguese or even Spanish speakers, and having it be structured as such would have been, a much more consistent with our with what we're trying to do as a district than what we currently have. But having said that, what we currently have has been incredibly successful. I think that, Carlos can speak to the level of proficiency of those students. I know that, I experience it as a Spanish speaker when I see those kids, and it's amazing, and we've done a tremendous job with that. And so I do feel that we have, we know that that can work, and if we were to do it differently, it is a viable model, but that is a bigger conversation that should not happen in the context of the budget.
Thank you. And do we know can you remind me the additional cost of that program?
And this could vary from year to year, but under its current configuration, we wind up with having to have an additional class at one grade level because of a small number of students that are in that particular grade that cannot be assimilated into the existing classes at the school. So if we didn't have it, that class could go away. Those class sizes would increase slightly at LISEF, but it would still be within our thresholds.
So the additional cost of the program is just the cost of one class?
If you look at the cost sheets, that was estimated at $60,000 as an average teacher cost.
I was just wondering when, because if my memory serves me, I think it wasn't that long ago that we were working to expand this program as well. Was it only just a few years ago?
I think that's correct. So I've been in the district 20 years, and this is I believe the second time that the elementary program has been in existence and then been considered for a cut. And I think there was at least one other time before that. So I think over the last 30 years or so, this, I believe, would be the third iteration of an elementary world language program that comes for a few years and then is eliminated usually for budgetary reasons. They have looked different in each of those years. This one actually started with third grade, and then somewhere during the last few years, due to some constraints, it was moved to fourth and fifth grade. Mm-hmm. So it's looked different.
So do you think the reason that it kind of occupies that sort of low-hanging fruit position, if you will, is because it's hard to build out a robust program and kind of, so we end up basically doing very incremental additions to the program, which are sort of not as effective as they could be, I guess, and then sort of easier to...
I think part of the answer to that is that the program that we have currently, and that I believe that we've had in the past, is based on research that does show that twice a week for 45 minutes or 3 times a week for 30 minutes it can get to the communication and proficiency baseline. Remember, these are students that most of them have not had Spanish before, so there's we need a longer period of time of comprehensible input and that receptive time in those younger years. Just as we all learn languages, we're not born speaking. We're usually listening and interacting for quite a bit. But students are the program takes into consideration that need. So there is some investment that's needed for that, and in terms of why these programs are cut, it's probably not unique to Portland, but other districts as well. I think is really a community-based decision and has financial reasons for it. So I don't know.
I mean, I think, it's, you also have to take into consideration that there are some things that we're required to do, and then some things that we're not required to do, and this is, we're not required to do. So this is an added feature in our education that is one of the reasons that I think it gets cut, is that you otherwise have to make reductions in things that may be required.
Right, okay. Are we, in surrounding districts, do we know how many have this type of program?
I believe Falmouth, Scarborough, and Cape Elizabeth have elementary Spanish programs, some of them starting in first grade, some of them in third grade. Those are three in southern Maine that I know of.
Are we still pretty unique in having the Spanish immersion program, or are there more?
We're the only one in the state currently, but across the country, immersion programs in many languages, but mostly Spanish, are common in larger urban areas.
Thanks.
One last thing that I would add, part of that elementary Spanish program is also part of a world language specialist reduction, and currently those duties around the seal of biliteracy and supporting some of the immersion, especially immigration paperwork, and our relationship with the Confucius Institute that donates a teacher to Portland Public Schools, that there are still services and needs that would be affected by that as well.
Sorry, I think you lost me there. So, and is that cut?
That is in terms of the elementary, up on the screen here, the
The 0.25 in academics is currently a half-time release staff person that would go to a quarter-time release person.
And is a quarter-time release person enough to provide the services that you just talked about?
Tough to say, but I would say that.
I don't have a good handle on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I could point out many positions whose sort of task list is larger than people feel is reasonable. So most jobs, on the academic team in general, we talk about departments of one, where people say everybody's job description is like 3 to 4. So I would just acknowledge that it's common that I think we have an incredible load on those positions, and I think in this case that would be the same. I think there's an effect. Just to be honest, I think what happens in these situations is work that we believe should be done can't get done.
So maybe it would be helpful to say what would this, how would the responsibilities change, and so what would still be
Right.
expected?
So we have not gotten to that level of granular planning around her delegation. Carlos and I were speaking about that earlier today in terms of how we would go about it. The rationale for going from a 0.25 or 0.5, to a 0.25 is that part of the responsibility is support and oversight of the elementary Spanish program. So that's the logic. So you understand that piece comes off. Therefore, there's that kind of theoretical assumption of a reduction in need. I think that as it exists as a 0.5, the sense is that it's way more that could happen. So as we were discussing, by taking off the world language chunk, it's not clean enough to say that that's exactly half of the half. It's just not. So there's going to be other things that get impacted, but that's how this, reduction came to be from, that was the logic behind it. Is that fair?
Yeah, thank you.
Adam?
Could you just share more about the Confucius Institute teacher that's donated to us? I've never heard about this before.
So I believe it's the University of Southern Maine and Portland Schools has a relationship with the Confucius Institute, and they select a teacher to come from China and be with Portland Public Schools and with the university to teach some classes for up to 3 years at no cost for us in terms of salary and benefits, but there are some costs around visa support and transition to living in Portland that we support them. That's our commitment.
And that position teaches Mandarin at both Casco Bay and at Deering as part of their assignment. And so that is, free teaching a position that is funded through the Confucius Institute.
And something in these reductions affects that, or no?
No.
Great.
No.
Okay. Tim?
Thank you. I have 2 questions. My kid takes a Spanish class at Longfellow that's offered by the PTO after school, and I'm wondering what other sorts of opportunities there are in the community or in our schools that might be out there for language acquisition for elementary age students.
We had a similar, well, I don't know if it's similar, but 2 years ago we had a grant-funded program through the Starting Strong grant for Arabic and French, for example, at East End. So each school community, I think, tries to supplement or expand language learning opportunities for their students or a subpopulation of their students. So it would take some legwork to find funding robust enough to replace a program like this. I'd say very difficult to do, but there probably are some smaller grants to help support once or twice a week after school for 30 minutes for a session of a quarter or so.
Yeah, I think the classes that I'm referring to are like a once a week after school. Certainly nothing to replace the program. That
More of an exposure to the language and culture.
Right. And I would also point out that I don't know about coverage at all of the schools, but I'm assuming, given that this is PTO funded, that it's not something that's
school by
generally
school.
Available to all the schools. My second question was around the impact on teachers. I hear the increased instructional time, and that seems like a big opportunity, but I'm wondering who is providing instruction during that additional time, and are we asking more of our elementary teachers in terms of classroom time with students based on this reduction?
I think it would depend on what does replace that time. There is a Spanish teacher that comes in twice a week, 45 minutes for 4th and 5th graders.
Yeah, I think we haven't, like I said, made plans around that. I mean, that would be in close collaboration with our principals. So it's not, I mean, I can't answer that directly because there's a variety of directions in which a school might go given the needs and priorities of the building that may or may not affect all classroom teachers, some other specialists, interventionists, things like that. Yep.
Any other questions on this? Yeah, Roberto.
I just wanted to get some clarification on one of the slides. The 30% of current seniors who are eligible for the seal of biliteracy. That doesn't mean that 30% of those seniors, Spanish is one of the two languages that they're proficient in.
Correct. This was my
So
question earlier. So this is all, so 30% of current seniors eligible for the seal in any language took elementary Spanish as third graders. And then, so some of the seniors eligible for the seal could be eligible in other languages. We talked about this. I don't know if you.
Most of the seniors that took Spanish in elementary school are getting the seal of biliteracy in Spanish. Some of them might be getting it in two languages, so Spanish and French probably, but most of them are in Spanish.
I think I understood that, but not 30% of the seal of biliteracy awards are Spanish, one of the two proficient languages.
Correct.
Okay. Do we know what percentage of the seal of biliteracy award recipients are using Spanish as their one of the proficient languages?
I can look and get back to you shortly.
And I don't know if this next question we can get as well, but one of the things that I've really appreciated about the seal of biliteracy is that one of the two language of proficiency happen to be the home languages of the students. So it'd be good to know of the ones that do use Spanish as one of the proficient languages, how many of them that is their home language and not something that they, quote unquote, learned in the schools.
I think 3 out of the 13 have Spanish as a heritage language or speak it fluently at home or were educated in it at some point. Of the 13 seniors, of these 13 seniors, yeah.
Okay, unless there's anything else, we'll move on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
And Malia.
Okay. So kind of switching gears again. So just going to hit a couple of follow-up items. I say part 1 on this slide just because we didn't get to all the follow-up items. Oh, I literally just put my face in the mic. Okay, great. So just going to hit a couple of them. Both of these are revenue items, and I know there's more on the list that we'll get to as we move forward. So this first one was in response to a question, I believe it was Ms. Thompson asked, and she'd indicated she was getting questions on from people on Facebook. This kind of shows incrementally where our revenue has come from in the proposed budget. So her question was, what would our budget be if there was no tax rate increase? So that first column that you see, the 118.4 million shows what our budget would be just with our increase in non-tax revenue for this year. We wouldn't have any reason to stop there because we get automatically through the new valuation an additional $993,000. So really, with no increase to the tax rate, just adding in our increase to non-tax revenue and the new revenue that we get just from the increased valuation, our budget would be $119.4 million. So that's the answer to her question. And then just moving along so you can see incrementally what 1% does, 1% on the tax rate does to our revenue. It's an additional $951,000 per percentage point on the tax rate. So 1%, our budget would be 120.4 million, 2%, 121.3, and 3% is where we landed for the budget. And this was in response to a couple members' questions, Ms. Trevorrow as well. This is just sort of a line-by-line delineation of different numbers you might see as we move forward for the detail around our state funding. So as I mentioned on Tuesday, our FY20 budget was that top line, 17.645 million. Over the course of FY20, we received a small $86,000 uptick in our aid as a result of a bus purchase that we made and got reimbursed for. And then our ED 279 currently states the 18.4 million, so you can see that's a $660,000 increase over our actual expectation for FY20. If you add that 86,000 to the 658, you see the figure that I had in the budget and in the presentation on Tuesday. And finally, as I indicated, we're expecting that number to go up by $235,000, which will bring us to state funding of $18.6 million, which ultimately we're expecting a total increase over our FY20 budget and state aid of almost $1 million. And as I mentioned on Tuesday, that $235,000 increase is currently in the budget, reflected as an increase to our use of fund balance. I do not expect to actually increase our fund balance use. I expect that we will drop that back down and receive that as subsidy. Okay. So we were just going to finish up with some district comparisons and some enrollment data that had been requested, I believe, by Ms. Figdor. If there's no other questions on the financials or anything. Yes?
Adam?
I just have one. I've seen in a couple places something about the determination that Portland will receive more money in revenue sharing, and I was just curious if there'd been any discussion of the schools getting a portion of that money that's coming to the city.
Do you know what revenue share? I mean, I can answer the second part of that. We have not had any formal discussions about that. So that's the answer to that. And then in terms of the revenue sharing.
I don't know what the figure is or the expected figure is for FY21 offhand, but it's definitely something I can come back to you on. We've looked at it. I can't recall offhand.
Yeah, I think the last time we were all before when the city council was talking about their budget, Brendan estimated at an additional $1 million in revenue sharing this year.
Okay, and I can follow up with him and see if that
would be
expectation is.
great.
Yep. Okay, so just moving on, you've seen these before if you attended the public forum, but we just thought we'd go over these again, maybe in a little more detail if you have any questions. This one is just showing comparisons of our per pupil spending as compared to our Southern Maine peers, and also our spending in excess of the state calculated EPS allocation. So you can see we're kind of just below the median, middle of the road in both of those categories. So this slide is comparing the funding sources, again, versus our peers. So this slide, the table on the left shows the percent of our budget that's paid for by the state. And then on the right, the school tax rates. So in theory, you'd expect these to be kind of a mirror image. You can see for Cape Elizabeth it is. But for us, despite having a very low percentage of our budget paid for by the state, our tax rate is still fairly low compared to our peers. And this just shows a comparison of our enrollment growth over time versus our budget growth over time. And despite the fact that our enrollment has decreased by less than some of the other districts on the list, our budget over the same period of time has grown by less. Did I say that right? Yeah, that's a tough one for me. Yes, exactly. So if there's no questions on that, I think we're going to move on to some enrollment trends. Move on.
And this is specifically something that Board Member Figdor asked that we include in our first Finance Committee meeting. So this first slide shows you the racial demographics of our student population over the past 10 years. So you can see a slight increase in the percentage of students that are students of color versus white, where we currently are at almost, almost 50-50. So you can see, I don't know, you're all looking very intently at the slide. We probably should have had bigger numbers on those. I recognize that. We can do that going forward. But, so currently 46.9% of our students are students of color, 53.1% are students that are white, and back in 2010 it was 36.3 and 63.7. So about a 10 percentage point swing in those 10 years. This is the enrollment of students who are economically disadvantaged, and you can see that there was a significant jump in 2015 and has pretty much remained constant since then, with a slight decrease over that time since 2015.
Here's a question on that.
Yep.
Can you account for what may be contributing to that jump?
No, I know that was a year that our enrollment dropped significantly. So that's the year that we had the 150-some students that dropped in enrollment, and I think that's my in my mind but I don't have actual evidence. We've not looked at see who left and who came in to see if that accounted for it. But that's my theory around it. Our homeless student population, even though it's relatively small as a percentage of the total budget, has increased very dramatically in these 10 years. So from roughly 1% of the student population, it's now 4% of the student population. As you know, these are students who have very complex needs, and these are, increasingly a large number of students in the district. And then the last two slides are interesting ones. I had not seen this laid out this way, because I think our general understanding is that this number has increased dramatically in the last 10 years, but you can see that the percentage of our students who are English learners has remained constant, with little fluctuations, but roughly at around a quarter of our student population through those years. The countries of origin, the languages, and so on have shifted significantly in that period of time, but the overall percentage has not. And the percentage of students with disabilities has remained, fairly stable in that time as well. And I think that was it.
Okay. Questions on any of that? Roberto?
On the question on the year where the drop in enrollment, the Baxter Academy opened around that time. Any way to know how many of the students enrolled there would be districted for Portland Public Schools?
Yeah, we have that. It's roughly a quarter of their overall enrollment, somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 students that are students that would attend Portland Public Schools. And let me just be clear that would attend Portland Public Schools or another school, but they would have been they are districted, they're Portland residents.
So where do you want to go from here? Are you looking for just general discussion, or?
Whatever you want. I mean, we envision at our next meeting talking about athletics, because that's one of the areas where there were additional questions. We can also at that time get into the reconfiguration, although I'm not sure that we want to do that as part of the budget. I think that's a conversation that we should have about where do you want to insert that, because I do feel, as I said in my original statement, that is something that I strongly believe we need to move forward with, but it is no longer a part of the budget proposal, so at some point we can do that. But otherwise, I think we've answered most of the questions that were posed at the board meeting the other day, and so I think from our perspective, do you have any additional questions? I mean, things that I'm taking away from today are some questions about the Spanish programming surrounding districts, the seal of biliteracy, percentage of students who are actually doing their seal of biliteracy in Spanish who are not native Spanish speakers, the revenue sharing questions. I don't know. I know other staff are taking questions as well. So I think we're just continuing to figure out what are the other things that you need to be able to have your deliberations. And then I think we need to have a conversation about the process going forward in terms of, hearings and things along those lines. Which I know we have some questions about legally what are our obligations around hearings and things like that we will be following up on.
So just process-wise, I mean, if we just are assuming that we are still going by our schedule, since that's kind of what we have before us, we're scheduled to vote this out of committee on Monday, March 30th, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And so between now and then, we have a meeting on Monday, which is supposed to include a public hearing. And then we have a joint finance committee meeting on the 26th. And then we have a short window of time in between that and our meeting where we're actually voting it out. So I'm curious to know from the committee how you feel about that timeline, given where we are with the budget, and thoughts about any amendments that might come up.
Yeah, well, I was wondering too, at what stage do we want to consider amendments? It does seem like we could be ready as soon as Monday, but I certainly don't want to get ahead of.
So let's just think process for a second. Technically, the budget that was referred to us by the board was the budget that was presented on Tuesday, and so the recommendations that you've made today are not technically part of that budget. So those would be amendments in and of themselves, correct?
Or we could bring, which is what I said during my statement, that we could bring a revised budget that
Right.
that does not include those. So you could do it through the amendment process. I'm offering them myself, so I envisioned actually bringing a different budget that reflects those things taken out.
I think that would be, it would be my preference. I've seen us do it both ways over the years. I've seen us vote on a list of separate amendments, and then in other years, we've kind of figured out ahead of time what we would like the total budget to look like with all amendments included, and then just voted on that. And that's procedurally, I think, simpler. But it would mean, I think, that the committee would have to be aware of, we would just need to kind of get stuff on the table that we would be looking to include in that in time for it to be put before us. So I think if that's going to happen on the 30th,
mean, I would prefer to come back to you with a revised recommended budget, and then if the committee is going to make recommendations, amendments, line item changes, that be the Finance Committee's proposed budget, as opposed to that it's the superintendent's recommended budget.
Okay. So then would you have that for us on Monday? Okay, so we would basically adopt an,
I was going to say.
I was trying to avoid looking at Miranda, but I made the mistake of looking and saw.
It should be possible for us to do that.
okay,
yeah.
so then, and then I guess committee members should also be prepared to have amendments that you want considered on Monday as well. And then we can have a final vote on the 30th. That makes sense. Does that sound like okay?
Yeah, I do want to just, back to the conversation that we started, we need to, by charter, have 2 meetings with the City Finance Committee in between the, the recommendation and what you bring to the board.
Right, and so our first one of those is on the 26th. So at that point, that's assuming, of course, that this schedule goes forward, but that, I think that would be good timing, because by that point, we'll have kind of deliberated the first round, and we'll be able to present kind of a good picture of what it's shaping up to look like.
So there would be no meeting in between the 16th and the 26th, is that correct? So I would bring back on Monday a revised version of your recommended budget, and then potential proposed amendments, and then joint finance committee. Do we need anything in between?
Maybe we should set a placeholder, just in case. Because it could be that on Monday, we figure out that we do need another meeting.
And I suspect that's the case. I think
Yeah.
that will likely be the case. And I think that we had purposely left a significant, time gap between the March 16th and the March 30th vote to, one, be able to have the meeting with the Finance Committee, but also for any additional adjustments on either end. I mean, not a ton of adjustments after the Joint Finance Committee meeting, but, at least enough time to be able to make adjustments after the Joint Finance Committee. If the Finance Committee of the board of the of the City Council, made recommendations that that you would consider, towards an amendment, we were trying to build in enough time to do that.
Okay. So does everyone want to look at their calendars? So we're looking between the 16th and the 30th. So do we want to stick with like Thursdays, the 19th, or?
The 19th, there is a DABC meeting, which I know Finance Committee member Balfonts is a part of, and
Okay.
And so is Ms. Victor. So,
That won't work. The 18th, which is a Wednesday.
I have a work meeting that'll take me till like 6:15 or 6:30. And then I'll be available after that.
The other alternative might be the 23rd, just given that we're doing a bunch of these on, I guess not a bunch.
I could
We're
do that.
doing some Mondays.
Yep, I could do the 23rd.
Does that work for you?
Okay.
so I know that I have contract negotiations with one of our unions scheduled for that day, and so does Chair Rodriguez. So that might be challenging for us.
Should we do,
Fridays off the table. I know which one.
Sorry.
Could we do the 18th at 6:30?
We could do the 18th at 6:30 or at 7, if that's better.
Yeah, I just need time to get here. So probably 7 would be better.
Okay. Does that work?
And this is a placeholder just if we need it.
Okay.
Yep. Is that everything on this? I did just want to say to the superintendent and staff that I have really appreciated the work that went into the first iteration of the budget. And it's clear to me, going through these slides today, how entwined it was. It really was kind of taking what we have for resources and really figuring out how best to meet the needs of students with the goals that we have in our Portland Promise. I appreciated what was put forward, and I'm sorry to kind of see some of the things that we're not able to do in this new iteration. So I just wanted to kind of let you know that, and hopefully we can work going forward to come up with something that suffices for this year. Emily?
I'll just say, and it won't come as a surprise, but I'll be looking to add some of the equity investments back into the budget while looking to eliminate the SROs. I really greatly appreciate the work that the superintendent and others have done with the police chief over the last few months in figuring out, I think, a workable solution on body cams. But given that we don't have the key support staff that we need, given the ratios that we have, I can't see the continued investment in SROs. I also find the program fundamentally problematic, and potentially looking to make additional cuts to athletics in order to pay for some of the increased investments, but I will look to make investments over the 3%. And I think that, as I see it, it's our job to say what our students need, and it's clear that our English language learners and special ed students need these increased investments. So I feel obligated to put them back in the budget. It's not, it won't be enough, but I think we still need to take a more meaningful step, or we need to take a meaningful step. And so I'll be looking to increase those investments.
And just that reminded me that if you need cost and estimates, if you're thinking of amendments, to just get in touch with Miranda to be able to work that out. Anything else before we adjourn? Seeing none, a call for a motion for adjournment. Mark, seconded by Emily. All those in favor? And we're adjourned.